Welcome to Crying Out Loud. I'm Dr. Laura Berman, and this is your grief companion. Join me to learn how to soften the pain, steady the nervous system, and connect to your loved ones on the other side. None of us were meant to grieve alone, so let's cry out loud together.
So I'm crying out loud, I'm not holding it in, I'm shrinking my heart.
There are some losses that change us forever, and for many of us, especially women, losing our mothers is one of them. Whether it happens in childhood or much later in life, it can quietly shape the way that we see ourselves, our relationships, our sense of safety, or even our identity in ways that we may not even recognize. My guest today is Hope Edelman, whose groundbreaking book, Motherless Daughters, gave voice to an experience millions of women had been carrying silently until that point. 30 years later, her work continues to transform the way that we understand grief, attachment, identity, and the enduring bonds we share with the people we love. In this conversation, we are exploring why grief is cyclical, how early mother loss can become developmental trauma, the difference between losing your mother early in life and later in life, why what happens after a parent's death matters so much, and how we can continue our relationship with someone, our mothers or anyone, long after they're gone, forever. Whether you've lost your mother or someone who filled that role in your life, or you're supporting someone who has, I hope this conversation leaves you feeling seen and understood and a little less alone. Here's my conversation with the amazing Hope Edelman. Hope Edelman, I am so excited to have you on Crying Out Loud and dive into this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Laura, for having me.
You know this. Your book came out 30 years ago. I remember reading it I guess it was 2011 when my mother died, but I was already familiar with the title. It's like, in my experience, a household name, and really still considered the seminal book on maternal loss. And we're going to dive more into what that really is and the different ways it can affect you. But when you look back on it now, what do you think you understood about mother loss then that the culture didn't understand yet, or maybe still doesn't understand?
You know, it's interesting. I started writing that book, and God, I was a baby. I was 27, 28 years old, and I was just writing a book I needed.
Right.
And for other women like me. And I went out into the world and started interviewing women and collecting their stories. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And I wrote a book that I think was what my 28-year-old, 29-year-old self needed. And I've had the really unusual experience of being able to revise that book several times. And so each time that I've gone back and revisited it at different stages in my life, and I'm just about to start the fourth and possibly the final edition of that book.
Well, never say never.
I have gotten in touch with what I know now that I didn't know then. So when I was writing this book in the early 1990s for the first time, the culture was still the popular culture was very much steeped in the stages of grief, and having grief move in a linear, one-directional path, ending at acceptance, kind of like you've arrived and now you're done.
There are these very linear direct stages you will pass through each gate, one after the other.
And the message, implicit or explicit, was if you don't do it that way, then your grief has gone awry or you have done it wrong. And so all the women that I was interviewing from Motherless Daughters were telling the story that I had experienced as well, which was that grief is cyclical, and that we could get to a feeling of completion and then 1 year, 2 years, 10 years later, have a resurgence of grief that needs to be processed again. And that moves us to another phase of our recovery or our adjustment or our integration, whatever word is most meaningful to you. And I became aware that acceptance is not an end point. It's a station that we return to and depart from, and return to and depart from many times over the course of our life after a loss. And that book came out in 1994, which was right around the time that the grief theory of continuing bonds was starting to emerge. And I didn't know that yet, but the book became part of that movement, completely, unplanned, which was saying, hey, we need to find ways to remain connected to our moms and carry them forward with us rather than trying to leave them behind or get over it or get past it. So I think that's why the message was so resonant at that time, because the women who'd lost their mothers knew that trying to leave her behind was not only impossible, but was causing them a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And that when they were given permission to find a way to remain connected to her and carry her forward, they had a sense of peace and felt like someone gave me permission. Someone gave me permission to do that. And now someone gave me permission to tell my story. My story matters. And I was deluged with letters from readers in those first couple of months when the book was released. This was pre-internet, so they all came by snail mail, which
Probably had bags and bags, right?
exactly, from the post office, carried bags of letters home to my apartment in New York City.
And what surprised you most about what they were sharing?
The detail with which they were sharing their stories, putting them down on paper as if they had held these detailed, perfectly intact stories inside of them, in some cases for decades. And now it was all coming out, which was what I had experienced with the interviews. Women who were eager to tell their stories, but had been waiting for someone to say, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, I think that's such a huge part of grief healing, that witnessing part. I want to get in a little bit into some of those milestones and the continuing bonds, but I just want to start with one of the things that, I think really strikes me and is important about your work is this idea of how differently the loss of your mother is experienced even decades, years out, depending on when it occurs, right? So, you were writing for a young woman, as a young woman in her 20s. That's not, typically we think of someone, if nature takes its usual course, you're much older when your mother dies. But how is the experience of losing your mother in your childhood, teens, 20s or 30s different than losing her, like I did? I mean, I was still pretty young comparatively. I was 40, but that's older than many, a lot of the audience that Motherless Daughters speaks to. But, how is that different when you lose your mom young versus, we won't say old, but more within the range, let's say, of what one might expect?
Well, it's a developmental trauma. It's a break in attachment, a permanent break in attachment in the physical world. And so the age that you were will determine what developmental stage you were in and what tasks you were learning and how a parent was helping you do that. And then in that parent's absence, you had to find some other way to learn how to manage disappointment or cope with guilt or answer big existential questions, whatever it is that your mom might have done for you if she was an engaged and consistent mother, if she had been. So I was 17 when my mom died. I was 15 when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. I was 17 when she died. Yeah, a few weeks after my 17th birthday. I was about to become a senior in high school. My sister was 14 and our brother was 9, almost 10. And those are three very different developmental periods. We tend to think adolescence, from 12 or 13 to 19, but the difference between being 14 and being 17 was
Huge.
pretty big. Yeah, pretty big. At 14, my sister was still quite close with my mother and didn't see anything wrong with her yet. Whereas I had already started, finding her faults and pushing against her and spending much more time with my friends. And I'd had my first boyfriend, and all of that factored in to what mother loss meant to me. Birth order means a lot too. As the oldest child, I was just expected to step in and start taking care of my father and my younger siblings. in a way that a youngest child is not typically expected to do. But losing a mom when you're under 12, um, even or 6 and under, is determined by your level of intellectual and emotional maturity. I mean, a small child, 4 or 5 years old, doesn't even really know what death is. Even if they've encountered it with a grandparent or a pet, they don't know what it means for someone to leave and never come back again. And it is a horrifying realization for a child that young who's trying to grow up and mature intellectually and emotionally to cope with what that means. Typically, we don't get a full understanding of death until about age 7. And that's why age 7 to 11 is such a hard time to lose a parent, because the child is developing the intellect to understand what death means, but doesn't yet have the emotional maturity to cope with the feelings that come around that, especially if their mom was the one who would have helped them manage those emotions and answer those questions. And now she's not there to do it because they're trying to adjust to a world in which she no longer exists. And then if you're a teenager, this is where I see a lot of guilt. A lot of daughters who feel like I should have treated my mom better. I could have made her life easier. I was pushing so hard against her. And I wish that I had been a better daughter, is what I hear a lot. They were being, what we would consider in most cases normal teenagers.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then their mom, especially if the mom died suddenly and not due to a long-term illness, they had no idea that the end of her life was coming near. So, and then, if you lose your mom when you're 18 to 25, because the book really looks at up to about age 25, which is not to say that if you were 27 or 28, you weren't deeply affected. It's just that losing a mom when you're younger than 25 and certainly younger than 18 means that loss and what happened after, how you were cared for, what you had to learn to do on your own, that all gets folded into your developing personality. Whereas when you're 40, you're bringing a pretty fully formed personality to that loss. That doesn't mean that you aren't deeply affected. You are, but you're affected in different ways than a child would be. So I'm really focused on the early loss. Again, 18 to 25, 1 foot in the family, 1 foot out in the world of independence. Not really sure, need that family base to come back to, just like the small child. And if it's taken away, you are thrust into what might feel like premature independence.
Yeah. And you talk about, you give this really compelling kind of laundry list of the kinds of things that show up in motherless daughters who lose their mother, in this range, in this age range. And while they're still developing their personalities, as you say, right, that it affects how they show up in relationships. You say anxiety about losing other people, the way they parent, their emotional development, feeling frozen sometimes at the age at which the loss occurred, and searching for nurturing in places that aren't going to be able to provide it, which I assume means getting into relationships with people who can't really show up for you, and just re-experiencing loss accidentally because of that again and again, right? So what do you think that, is the common thread going through that? I mean, well, I'll let you speak to all of that rather than pose a question to you, because I'm sure you have lots to say just on that topic.
I do. Yes, there are so many different ways that this can and often will show up over the course of a woman's life. But I would say that one of the main and consistent responses that I hear among the women that I work with is feeling different from other women. And that often gets framed as feeling deficient in some way, that they don't have something that other women have. And I can't say that that's not true. They are different from other women if they grew up without a mother. They are lacking something that other women had, which was a mother-daughter relationship that carried into and through their adulthoods. So they are different from other women, but the story that they tell themselves about that is usually one of not fitting in, of not belonging, of not feeling that they are able to be an adult in the same way that their peers are.
Yeah, and it also makes sense to me just with what we understand about trauma and that idea of losing a mother early is a form of developmental trauma that we sort of do stay
Right.
frozen,
Right. And
that
this
a
is
part of us stays frozen at that age where the trauma occurred.
exactly. And that's why so many women say, I feel like a kid, a big kid in an adult's body, because part of their development was arrested, which was the part of them that was able to have a relationship with their mom. There's a piece of me that will always be a 17-year-old. And that's the piece of me that's in relationship with my mother, in living relationship with my mother. Now I've found other ways to have a relationship with her internally. So part
Yeah, I definitely I wanna dive into that. It's so juicy. I wanna save it for a minute more, but we definitely wanna get into that. That's a huge part to me of grief healing in general, but especially there's some beautiful aspects to it that I know you speak to, and I've also experienced with the mother loss. Losing your mother, though, is you're kind of speaking to this, but it's not just like losing her, it's losing someone, and this was true for me at 40 too, even though my identity was pretty, obviously pretty formed. It's losing someone who witnessed your entire story,
yeah.
and how does that affect one's sense of identity? Like, what happens when there's no longer someone there? I mean, maybe you have another parent, although even in your story, as you shared, and I know in many people's stories, a lot of how the child does or the young adult does through losing a mother is to what extent the other parent, if they're there, is able to show up or not. But
100%.
yeah,
I can't overemphasize that enough. That what happens after a mother dies can have as much effect on a child or teenager as the loss itself. If they lose warm, loving, consistent caregiving after their mother dies, much of the rest of their development is going to be about creating adaptations to manage without that form of caregiving. And they may have a surviving parent there who continues to raise them, or they may be sent to live with other relatives, or they may be 19 years old and completely on their own. I work with a lot of women whose moms were single mothers and they don't have a father in their lives that they can go live with, or maybe their father died first. Or maybe then have to go and live with their father and a stepmother and his new family, and they have to leave their school, their neighborhood, their friends. So that has a cumulative effect. When I wrote the first edition of Motherless Daughters, and even when I wrote the third edition, I think, and this is why I'm so excited about doing a fourth, the research on adverse childhood experiences and complex PTSD was still pretty thin.
yeah.
So it's not in the book. And it is so informs the work that I do now that I can't wait to get it in there. Because what happens after a mother dies, if you have a caregiver who struggles with mental illness or addiction, or just has to work 3 jobs to help the family survive, and you experience a form of neglect, even benign neglect, will affect you and your sense of belonging in the world, your sense of trust that other people will show up for you.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, that's really what the teachings about trauma in general, right? It's as much, yes, it's part of it is the wound itself, but so much of it has to do with how things were handled after and what kind of support you received after and what kind of integration you were allowed to have after. Um, so I think that's beautiful. All right, so let's dive into continuing bonds because this is like some of my favorite stuff to talk about. Um, for so many years in, certainly from the early years of when you wrote that book first, when it first came out, there's kind of this tendency to talk about how part of healing and this quote unquote acceptance stage that we're all supposed to get to once and then be done, is, that if you're successful, then you've let go of that person. And obviously, we're letting go of them in human form. But this idea of continuing bonds to me has been so central to my own grief experience, losing my mother, my father, others, and especially losing my son.
Sure.
But I would love for you to speak to how your understanding of continuing bonds has evolved over the years.
Yes. Well, I was grieving my mother as a teenager, like I said, in the climate of you go through these 5 stages and then you're done. And so it was such a relief to discover the work of Phyllis Silverman and Dennis Class and others who promoted the idea of continuing bonds, which interestingly enough, you might know this, but some of your listeners might not. The continuing bonds theory developed out of the Harvard Child Bereavement Study, which was interviewing children about the loss of a parent. And the interviewers discovered that the children were finding ways to remain in relationship with the parent. And then when they interviewed the parents about this, they discovered that the surviving parents were doing the same thing with the spouse who had died. They just weren't telling anyone because the cultural message was that this wasn't how you're supposed to grieve.
And were the kids doing it because they saw the parents doing it, or were they
No.
mostly doing it on their own?
Because they missed their father or
Yeah.
their mother, and
Yeah.
they would hold on to items, cherished items that had belonged to the parent. They would talk to the parent at night before they went to bed. See, they were creating a changed relationship, and that's how I see continuing bonds, is that it's not about letting go of our attachment to a loved one. It is about changing the relationship with them and the way that that attachment is expressed in the physical world, now that we are the only one left in the physical world to continue that relationship. And it's so interesting. I work both with women who have recently lost their moms and women who lost their moms years and decades ago. And what I find is that the women who've just lost their moms are looking for ways to stay connected to her and continue that bond. The women whose moms died decades ago are looking for ways to reconnect with the mother because there's often been a disconnect in that relationship. And the reason that disconnect exists for most of them is because their families would not talk with them about the mother after she died. And I'm going to imagine that this is really going to resonate with some of your listeners who may have lost a mother or a father or any loved one decades ago. The whole ethos of the time was don't talk about things that upset you. Let's get past it. Let's focus on the future. Let's get back to life and not
bury it and I'll go away.
Right. And so no one would talk with them about their feelings, certainly, because there was no grief support back in 1981 when my mother died, and even less in the decades that preceded that. But no one would talk with them about their mother's life and tell stories about her. And they would self-silence because they didn't want to upset the father or their grandmother. They didn't want to rock the boat. There's such a fragile status quo that develops after an essential family member dies that children are scanning the room and thinking, is it safe to talk about this? No, I think I can't. And I don't want to see my dad cry because what if that means he's going to fall apart and he's all I have left?
Right.
So a lot of women just stop talking about their moms. And you can't, it's really hard to have an inner relationship with someone if you lost her when you were 6 or 12 or 15 and no one will acknowledge that she even existed. And so they're looking for ways to reconnect. And that's what I do in the Motherless Daughters retreats is we help women build bridges between their relationship with their mom in the past and who they are today so they can walk across it, find her again, and bring her back into the present with them. It's almost like shamanic soul retrieval work.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to talk a little bit in a minute about some of the more, metaphysical ways that we continue those bonds, or maybe we can talk about it here, but just can you give us a few examples of what it looks like to build that bridge, whether you're building it soon after your mother lost or rebuilding it after, having felt that, having had that externally forced disconnection happen?
Well, a simple way to do it is to say her name. We often say, my mother died when I was 13, but you can say, my mother Sally died when I was 13. Give her a name, let her be a real person in the world. And you can often shift it and say, my mother's name is Sally, and she died when I was 13, because it's still her name. That still is your mother's name. Photos of her around the house. So many women that I work with who lost moms when they were young don't have a photo of her around the house. Some of them don't have a photo at all, but they might have a memento that they telling stories about her. If you have children, referring to her as your grandmother, Mary, rather than my mother, because that allows them to have a relationship with her and not just consider her as someone who existed only in relationship to you, their mom. So there are all kind of ways that we can do it. And we do this in the retreat. We also do this lovely guided meditation that brings women to into a meditative state where they can go and find their mom again and have a conversation with her and come back and write about it and write her letters, and making her more real in the imaginal world.
Yeah, we do that at our retreats too for grievers, but especially for mamas, kind of crossing that bridge and
Right.
that theta state can be really powerful.
It can.
One of the things you're reminding me, there was this moment not long after my mother died, which was my worst, most impossible loss that I could imagine at 40. Before my child died, that was bigger. But this loss is huge and was huge for me. And I remember I was walking in the park and I was thinking about my mom. And I don't remember what led to this, but I suddenly had this like grace filled epiphany, like this realization. Cause I think I was thinking like, who was my mother? Who has my mother been to me in the physical form, at this age and stage? She was my cheerleader. She was my touch point. She was the one that always wanted the best for me. She was, the one that could be silly. She was my mirror in many ways, and I was going through all those. And then suddenly I had this like flash, and I almost feel like it was her, where I was like, oh, like she did do all of those things and she was all of those things, but I am assigning all of those, like I am all of those things to myself. And when I do it for myself, it doesn't have to be just me doing it for myself, cheering myself on or checking in with myself or attagirling myself or wanting the best for myself. It can be her wanting it too. And for some reason, it just gave me I just got flushed. I'm just remembering that moment as we're talking, but I got flushed with so much gratitude and grace. I don't know I do feel like it probably came from her because it just came out of thin air. But she was almost saying, like, you are already that for yourself. You didn't need me at this point to be that for you. No, you let me be that for you. And when you are that for yourself, it's me who has implanted it in you and me still doing it.
That's beautiful. And how did you feel?
I just felt great. Like I felt, I didn't understand grace back then the way I do now. But that's what I felt. I felt just flushed with this warmth and comfort and connection to her and awareness. I was already kind of starting to dive into the quantum realms. So this awareness that energy can't be created or destroyed, just change form, and that her energy of which she was made is still, it lives forever, even if her physical body wasn't here anymore. So, I was starting to kind of, or be in that whole rabbit hole. So it kind of all came together in that moment. But yeah, it's really beautiful. And this idea of dreams or internal conversations or signs, the more metaphysical aspects of those continuing bonds. Where do you tend to land on that in your experience?
Oh, well, I wrote an entire memoir called The Possibility of Everything. So I'm I'm open to really, I think anything's possible. There's no one who can tell you that was your mother in that moment, and there's no one who can tell you it wasn't yet.
Yeah.
Or there are people maybe who feel certainty, but we can't scientifically prove it. But I think that your awareness and your belief that that was your mom that's your guide.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I wrote in the After Grief, which is my most recent book, which is about the long arc of loss and how how loss will keep showing up and grief keeps showing up throughout our lives. And that doesn't have to be cause for suffering. That in fact, it can be cause even for joy later down the road. I write about a scene when I was in my 30s. It was right around the time Motherless Daughters came out. So I was about 30. And some really big stuff was going down in my family, not just like, garden variety chaos, some really big stuff. And I found myself out on my boyfriend's fire escape on 51st Street in New York City at about 1 a.m, sobbing. I didn't want to wake him up. And I just went out on the fire escape and I was just sobbing because I didn't know what to do. It was more than I felt I could handle by myself. I needed a parent. I didn't have one. In fact, it was my other parent that was part of the drama that was unfolding. And I found myself through my sobs spontaneously asking my mother for help and telling her, I can't do this myself. I need you. Please let me feel you. And this, I don't know, within just a minute or two, this overwhelming sense of peace came over me and calm. And it wasn't like I heard a voice saying everything's going to be okay. It was just that otherworldly knowing you're going to get through this. And I just felt like somehow her hand reached through, broke through, the ethos and it put her arm around me. And I thought, I'm going to be okay. And I went back in and I immediately fell asleep. And I woke up in the morning and I got a phone call. Well, the first phone call I got told me your book just hit the New York Times bestseller list, which was crazy.
Amazing.
And the second phone call was one that started resolving the problems.
Wow.
And I was just in this state, I can't describe it any other way than feeling a state of awe and wonder and belief in the unseen. Yes, I'm a believer, Laura.
I just had that experience with my mom. And it's interesting because she has taken a back seat in my awareness since Sammy died. He's been, understandably so. But she's been coming back in a lot lately, probably because it's 5.5 years out and I'm ready for it. And I recently was going through this whole thing. My dad died back in 2018, I think it was, or 17. But all this stuff came up with their estate and just really messed up things. And I could not, the players involved were entrenched. And I could not see a way to get those more nefarious forces out of the way. And I literally, in this moment of desperation, I was like, I don't see a path, but mom and dad, but especially mom, because you were the one behind most of their, anything that they left. I need your help. Like, I can't do this. I need your help. I have no idea what the solution is. And nobody that I was consulting with knew what the solution could, like, they're basically like, this is legally binding. Like, there's nothing you can do about this. And the next day, same thing. I get a call from one of the people connected, sort of who was on my side of things. They're like, hey, it just occurred to us that there's this back sideways way that we could potentially undo this or unravel this in this way. And it worked. And I feel like it was totally her doing it. Not that they grant every wish we ask. I don't mean to imply that, but there have been those many moments where you can really call on them. And, those who do ancestral healing and ancestral work are constantly saying, talk to your ancestors, talk to your loved ones on the other side. They're always, like all angels and guides, they can only help us if we ask. But
I saw a reel this morning on Instagram. It was a reel of a bird, and it said, if you don't see a red bird and say, hi, mom, you and I don't exist in the same world.
That's
what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's basically my world. And Susan Gra, who's an amazing, gifted, true medium and a really dear friend of mine, she always says, if you can't tell me the color of the flowers you saw coming into my office, don't expect to see the signs from your loved ones on the other side, because you have to pay attention. You have to say, hi, mom, or hi, whoever. And then even if they didn't send the cardinal, they're like, "Oh, cardinals are our connection, so I'll send more cardinals."
Every single woman that I've worked with, I can say, what tells you that your mom is still here some way? Like, I'm going to say almost, well, I haven't asked every woman, but the majority of women I encounter know what the sign is, whether it's finding a penny or
Yeah.
it's a hummingbird, or for my sister and I, it's the number 38, which was our
Yeah.
favorite number. We see
Aw.
38s everywhere. They show up in the most unexpected places.
And that's a random number. It's not like 1111, which I see all the I mean, that's technically random too, but, more commonplace. Yeah, mine is, it's evolved. First, it was just hummingbirds, and I asked her this was like, maybe 2 months after she died and during the winter in Chicago, and I was trying to think of what a sign would be that wouldn't be easy to have, in Chicago in the winter, and I said, "Okay, mom, I'm gonna say a hummingbird. That's our sign. So you show me a hummingbird." And I went downstairs, my kids were little, and watching the Nature Channel, which I'm not even sure is on air anymore, but it was where they have all these nature shows. And they were watching a freaking documentary on hummingbirds. And
Oh,
then every day for a year, I saw a hummingbird. And now over the years, when I somehow, I don't even remember how this changed, but a hummingbird shows up when I'm speaking the truth. Like whenever I'm saying, this is what I think I should do, and a hummingbird, or this is what I think is happening here, or this is what I see for you, or whatever, if the hummingbird will show up in that moment, not always, but when it does, I'm like, okay, mom. Yeah, I get like I'm speaking the truth. That's what it means to me now that she's like, yes, confirmation. So it's
exactly.
cool. I mean, that's, I guess, all continuing bonds, right?
I think so. And I think, it shows up in unexpected ways. Like a dragonfly is the emblem of Motherless Daughters retreats because the dragonfly metamorphosis so closely parallels what we hope the women will experience coming to this 4-day encounter. And when they leave, they say they see dragonflies everywhere in places that they could never imagine. In fact, yesterday morning, we were closing a retreat in Connecticut. We were standing in our closing circle, holding hands. We were outside. I was thanking my co-facilitator. And as I was thanking her, a dragonfly landed on her leg.
Mm.
And the group said, "Oh my God, it's amazing." And I said, "But you see, this will happen now. It's like
Yeah.
we've opened up a field for that to happen, and now it's going to happen." And so I think the same must be true with you and hummingbirds.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely think my mom's a hummingbird. Sammy's a monarch, which I thought was going to be way too common. And I shunned the idea right after I had it. After he died, I was like, okay, I think he's going to be a monarch, but everybody's sign is a monarch. And I see them everywhere. I'm not going to say monarchs. And then my husband, 2 days later, who doesn't believe in any of this stuff, even though I like live and die by it, he doesn't argue with me about it. I don't argue with him about his beliefs. It's all good. But all of a sudden, this guy who doesn't believe in any of this, a monarch butterfly flies past us. And he says, huh, maybe Sammy's a butterfly. Maybe that's how he's going to communicate with us. And I was like, okay, he's definitely a butterfly. If my husband just brought that up.
Well, maybe monarchs and hummingbirds are the messengers.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Maybe
think
the
they are. I
species
don't
that
think it's
are
literally
maybe the other
them.
species that have been designated as messengers from the
Yeah.
other side.
Yeah, they certainly are popular messengers for many of us. Yeah, I like it. And then they're supposedly easy for the energy to move and manipulate too, because they're so little and cooperative and high vibration
And beautiful.
and beautiful.
Mhm.
Now, I know you speak to this. I don't know to what extent. I don't remember to what extent this probably didn't get covered much in Motherless Daughters, but maybe in other books. When you're two things about complicated relationships with mother, there are these people that talk about mother hunger, which usually refers to kind of being a motherless daughter, but with your mother still living. You're estranged from your mother. She's abusive. You can't have a relationship with her. You wish you could have a relationship with her, and so on. And then there are also the people who are grieving someone who really hurt them or abandoned them or never really gave them what they needed. So for those of us who had beautiful relationships with our mothers, that continued bond and that healing, it's horrible and horrific, but it's also, there's that path for it. What can you share with us about both of those things? It's kind of like I hesitate because I know it's sort of like for women, for mothers who have lost a child, when another mother comes up and says, I know just how you feel. My child hasn't talked to me in a year, then they get, we're like, fuck you, so I don't mean to minimize women, but women who have, lost their mothers to death. But I don't want to ignore those women because there's real grief there. And the women whose mothers have died, but they didn't have a good relationship with them.
Right. Well, I say there are many different ways to be motherless. And my understanding and my work with the mother hunger community has given me an appreciation that the overlap is that if you had a mom who wasn't available to mother you for some reason, she left the family, but is still alive. She was incarcerated. She had mental illness. She was addicted. She wasn't interested in being a mother. She had so much trauma of her own that she couldn't be attuned to her children. You've lost what is called guidance and protection and nurturing. And many of the women whose mothers died lost the same three things. So we tend to present in the world in some similar ways later on because none of us had that after a certain point or ever in the case of some women who have mother hunger. But the difference is that if your mother is living and somewhere out in the world, there may still be the hope or the belief that one day things might change. If your mother died, you don't have that hope unless it's an unrealistic one. And that's where those two groups depart, which is why I don't work with women whose mothers are still physically living. But I do work with a lot of women because they don't mix well in groups.
Yeah,
For
I agree.
exactly the reason that you just brought up. There need to be separate groups for estranged parents and those who lost a child to death. I firmly believe. And same thing with mother loss. But I do work with a lot of women who had very complicated relationships with their mothers, and then the mothers died. And that's just more to untangle and work through. And there are ways that you can heal that relationship. And in some ways, it may even be more successful than it would have been in the real world. To tap into the love that your mom did feel for you at some point, or if nothing else, to tap into the gratitude for her having given you life and working through that. Complicated relationships can result in complicated grief. Not always. I don't love the term complicated grief because I think all grief is complicated for each griever, in its own way. But a kind of grief maybe that gets stuck, that keeps circling the drain, that can't move on, that gets congested because the relationship was so ambivalent. We can help those women, those daughters, resolve some of the aspects of that relationship so that they feel that they can make progress with their grief. And it may be that they're going to decide to carry their mother forward in different ways or not at all, but maybe they will find a different way to tap into maternal energy and carry that forward.
Yeah, I know for me, I had that complicated relationship with my dad, although I would say I had an opportunity to forgive him and thank him and reach some degree of closure before, right before he died. But it's very different grieving him than grieving my mother because I have such complicated feelings about him. But I also feel, and I think you're speaking to this, that there is an opportunity, even if they aren't here in physical form anymore, to create clarity and closure with them posthumously, even though you couldn't necessarily do it while they were here.
And to acknowledge that it's okay to feel some relief.
Yeah, I've
If
definitely felt
a
that.
parent you have a complicated relationship with dies. Jeanette Purdy's book, I'm Glad My Mother Died,
Yes, that's a good
popular
one.
for a reason.
Yes.
There are likely lots of other women out there who felt the same way. Like, it's easier to have a relationship with my mother in her absence than it was when she was alive. And it's in that absence that some of that healing work can happen then.
Yeah, I agree. So if you could leave listeners with one, I know there are a million truths, but one truth that took you a long time to learn, what would it be?
I've been talking for a long time about this concept that two things can be true. And now it's very popular. It's almost a meme that's overused. Two things can't be true. But it made a huge difference to me to step out of binary thinking and say, two states that can seem like contradictions or opposites can both be equally true.
Yeah.
I can feel sorrow and I can feel gratitude.
Yes.
I can feel sad that my mom died so young. She was only 42. I can feel so sad about that and wish it had never happened. And also be grateful for the good things in my life that happened as a result of my mother dying. I mean, my two daughters exist because my mother died, because I met their father through having written a book about my mother dying. So that's a clear example to me of how my mother's death set in motion a chain of events that led to some really beautiful, wonderful things. And I can still feel really sad that she died and wish she hadn't.
Yeah, I totally see that. Yeah.
And I can also say my father did the very best that he could with the tools that he had to raise 3 children after the death of his wife, who had been a stay-at-home mom. And it's equally true that in that situation, he was the adult, and it was his responsibility to do more and do better for his 3 children. And both of those things can be true. And when I was able to acknowledge that these things are both true and build narratives, this is through my work in narrative therapy, which is all about developing narratives that are equally true. You don't have to put down the narrative that your mom's death maybe was the hardest and saddest thing that ever happened to you, but you can build a corresponding alternate narrative, parallel narrative, we should call it, a parallel narrative in which that death gave you some qualities and some experiences that you feel grateful for and that you wouldn't want to trade. So we don't ever get the choice of, well, would I rather not have my children and have my mother back? I mean, we do a lot of horse trading in our mind, right? I wish, would I give up this to have that back? Those are just mental games we play with ourselves. We're never going to have that choice. That's not a real decision that will ever be presented to us. So I'm a firm believer that we need to embrace the life that we do have and live it to the best of our ability and honor those people, we loved who are no longer here through how we live our life. We have a saying at Motherless Daughters that the best way you can honor a mom who's no longer living is to take good care of her daughter.
Amen.
And so we're committed to doing that.
That's a beautiful place to end. I could keep talking to you forever, but I know you have retreats, you have offerings. We'll put the books or whatever books you want to mention in the show notes, but where else, and we'll put this in the show notes too, but where else should people look to find you or to learn more about some of the offerings you have?
Over at hopeedelman.com, on the homepage, there's a freebie, a video, a self-guided journal you can get completely for free. I offer weekly support group calls and 4-day retreats and individual coaching, and it's all there at the website, hopeedelman.com.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Hope, for all you do and for sharing all your wisdom here. I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you. Thank you
so much.
Thanks for listening and crying out loud with me. If something you heard today helped or made you feel less alone, please follow, share, and review. And for more tools and a community that deeply understands you and your pain, visit the Grief Healing Collective at drlauraberman.com/grief healing. I'll see you next time on Crying Out Loud.
There's a hollow in my chest where your laughter used to be. Space at every table, an empty seat I see. The woman I was before you left didn't make it through, but love is still alive in me and still there between us two. They say just let it be alright. Just keep your pain inside, but love deep and pain this true were never meant to hide. So I'm crying out loud, I'm not holding it in, I'm shrinking my heart for the shape I am in. If grief is the echo of love that resounds, then I will love you crying out loud. Ooh. Some days grief's a tsunami, some days it's just a wave, some days I'm barely breathing, some days I feel so brave, but I am learning slowly what the breaking's about. The only way to freedom is feeling it out. Every tear that hits the ground is not a sign I'm weak. It's the sound of love still reaching, still learning how to speak. So I'm crying out loud, let the whole world see. Love didn't leave, it's alive in me, and the dark's a doorway if you let it be found. We don't heal by hiding, we heal crying out loud. What if the ache is holy? What if the wounds to go? What if the heart that's shattered can love even more? I'm softer in the tender places, fiercer where I stand. Grief didn't end my story, remade who I am. So I'm crying out loud when my hands unbound, not apologizing for the tears I found. If this is the cost of a love so proud, then I will live in